So like I said, I was going to be focusing on mountain lions and bears, and more specifically, I'm going to be focusing on their behavior. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about their conservation history. And the idea behind this is that if you understand where we came from and where we're at now, you'll understand hopefully a little bit more of how many of these large carnivores we have on the landscape. So in Montana, we have two different types of bears, and who can tell me what those two types of bears are? Two species. Grizzly
Black
bear
and grizzly. Black and grizzly.
Black and grizzly. And I'm going to get into a little bit later on how to tell the difference between the two, but I'm going to focus on both of them, and more specifically on where we're at in terms of population numbers with the grizzly bear. But the important thing to come away from this presentation is we've kind of moved our direction in terms of the messaging that we're delivering to people on this, is that it's not as important to be able to tell the two species apart in an encounter as it is to read their behavior. And the reason why is because when you have a bear encounter, it's going to probably be pretty quick, pretty sudden, and we don't want you to get hung up on being able to have to ID this bear when it's coming at you. So I'll talk a little bit more about behavior towards the end.
And Lori, real quick, everyone that's joining us online, could you mute your microphones, please?
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's great. So what I'm going to start off is talking a little bit about the conservation history of Montana, and more specifically towards these large carnivores and predators that we have in the landscape. And falling in that category is obviously our bears and our mountain lions. And so what does conservation mean? Because that's something that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks really focuses on, is conserving the fish and wildlife of the state. So what does conservation mean, you think?
Conservation means not only conserving what we already have as far as where the resources are currently, but trying to get them to the level of the actual carrying capacity and the environment they were in prior to.
Yep, that's pretty close. So really it's about protecting or restoring wildlife and their habitat. But a lot of people don't understand is it's not just that. The big part of what we focus on too as well at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is figuring out how to make sure both wildlife and people's needs are taken care of. So it's finding a place in the landscape for these animals, but that also we have to take into consideration people's needs. And that is often sometimes maybe their livelihood that they're making on the land. It could be safety, but we're always trying to balance that. And so when you think about the conservation history, I also, the reason why we do these programs, and hopefully when you walk away from here you'll have a better understanding of these two species, is that through knowledge is how we get an understanding, but also how we gain an understanding to the point where we care about these animals and hopefully we will conserve them. And I love this quote here, it says, "For in the end we will conserve only what we love love only what we understand will understand only what we are taught." So today, a big focus of my presentation is going to be on understanding bears and mountain lions. And so when you look at the conservation history of not just mountain lions and bears, but also wolves, and even a lot of our hooved friends, which are like our deer and our elk, the things that we like to hunt, or the things that we like to watch as far as wildlife, it has a very rich history here in Montana, and a lot of people don't understand this history, and I know this because I do a lot of presentations for our youth, and often they do not understand the history of our fish and wildlife in this state. So I'm just going to share briefly a little bit in the context of mountain lions and grizzly bears. So if you look at these two maps, you can see that at one point, well, that's right, you'll see at mountain lions to the left, historically their range was throughout all of the United States. And the same thing, if you look at the bear, at the grizzly bear over there, you'll see that it was through most of, at least through the Midwest part of the lower 48. So what do you think happened? Because the yellow over on the grizzly bear represents where they are now. So how do we go from having so many bears and so many mountains on the landscape, and also their distribution being very wide and far, to where we're at now? Does anybody have any ideas?
People.
So people. There's definitely people. Anything more specific?
Hunting.
So it's sort of about hunting, but more specifically it's commercialized hunting. Any other ideas?
Population. Well, I guess that's the same as people. Population growth.
So it wasn't so much that like our populations increased so much that they lost their habitat. That's sort of what's happening now. But first thing that started happening, and it was usually like around the mid-1800s, is their prey population started decreasing. So the things that these large carnivores like to eat started to decrease on the landscape. And does anybody have any idea what happened to the prey populations? Why were they decreasing? And you said something here, Stormy, about hunting. So one of it was commercialized hunting. And so the thing that was kind of interesting about our history is when we came to the West and we started settling this area, we not only brought ourselves and our families, but we also, there was a few industries that started to really take off, like your mining, your railroad. All those industries brought with them workers, and they had to figure out a way to feed these workers. And so they turned to commercialized hunting. And so if you look right here in the right-hand corner, that is a picture of an actual game market here in Helena. And so now when we go in the grocery store, we can go in there, we can buy pork or chicken or beef. Back then you could go in and say, oh, I think I'll take 2 mule deer, or I think I'll take 3 elk. Or if you had a really large crew, you might say, I'm going to take 20. And so when they were going out hunting, they were wiping out huge numbers at a time. And that's why you will see pictures often of where there's like these large skulls and they've wiped out the bison. Like, have you ever seen that picture where the bison has a big, huge pile of skulls? So it was, some of it was for furs, but most of it was to keep people fed. And then in addition, what we brought with us was livestock. And so when these prey populations decreased dramatically, the things that these large carnivores like to eat, what do you think they turned to? The livestock. So that created yet an additional problem. So if you were a rancher back then and maybe you had a herd of sheep or cattle, and then all of a sudden you had these large predators coming in what they call now is depredation, killing this livestock, what might you think?
I need to kill that bear.
We need to get rid of them. And so at that time we didn't really have an understanding of the role of these large predators in an ecosystem or how important they were to the landscape. So they just instituted what was called predator control. And that meant that you could kill mountain lions. Oh, here's that picture I was looking for. Here's a picture. So for example, wolves, you could cure black bear, grizzly bear, these large predators. And so when you think about it, like even for the wolves, the bison removal eliminated the most abundant prey for wolves in numbers and biomass. And so they instituted this predator control, and along with it, they implemented bounties. So you could go out and make a really good living killing these large carnivores. You can make anywhere from $25 to $50 a head. And back then that was a lot of money. So very quickly they started wiping out a lot of those large carnivores, a lot of those large predators. And so there was a group of people that looked, there was actually 2 groups of people primarily that looked around, and they realized pretty soon that most of our wildlife was wiped off the landscape through either commercialized hunting or through this predator control. And they went to the federal government and they started putting a lot of pressure on the federal government. And as a result, agencies like Fish, Wildlife, and Parks came about. They put rules and regulations in place. They switched animals from being classified as a predator to a game animal where there was rules and regulations around their hunting. Instead, you couldn't just no longer go out and just kill something by any means and at any time. So who do you think were those 2 groups of people, primarily? So it was hunters. It was also tribal members. So it was a lot of pressure from tribes as well. And that's really why when they say that hunters are some of our first conservationists in our country, they truly are. And even to this day, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is primarily funded by hunting and fishing license dollars. We don't get any general funds, no taxes. So as a result, the prey populations started to increase, like in the 1950s. And in fact, before that, like your great-grandma, like my great-grandma, you would be rare to see a mule deer on the landscape. Like it would be unusual. In fact, in North Dakota, a coworker that I work with, his grandma saw a mule deer and thought it was a kangaroo. That's how rare it was. And so then, as a result of all these rules and regulations being changed and agencies managing the fish and wildlife better, the prey populations started to increase. And so that was really good for these large carnivores. And in addition, they took away those bounties. And they took away all that predator control. They switched a lot of them under what was called a game animal instead. So your black bears, your grizzly bears, your mountain lions. Wolves were pretty much extinct by 1936 in our state, and they were starting to make a natural recovery from Canada into like the glacier area, but they sped up that process by reintroducing them as well. So these carnivores populations started to recover. And if you look at this map right here, they set aside these recovery systems for the grizzly bear. And unfortunately, we did have a hunting season grizzly bears, but it just wasn't working. And so when the Endangered Species Act came about, they put the grizzly bear on the threatened species list. And these recovery systems were areas that they were trying to build those populations up. And this is really important to kind of understand when, in the context when you hear about the grizzly bear being delisted, it's usually in a particular ecosystem. And most recently, it was in that far right ecosystem in the Yellowstone area. So ever since probably, I'd say 1978, we've been doing this idea of recovery. Recovery of the grizzly bear and recovery of the wolf. Now, as you guys know, the wolf is now delisted in our state, and we have a hunting season on them. And the grizzly bear is now delisted in the Yellowstone area. Mountain lions rebounded pretty quickly. And so when you look at this next picture, I just want to give you a sense that this recovery for the grizzly bear has been in place for about 40 years. And it's been a lot of hard work from a lot of different agencies and private landowners too. So we are continually monitoring these bears to figure out where their population is at, how many young they're having, where are they moving to, are they surviving, are they a healthy population, and trying to recover the bear. But now we're focused, now that these populations have recovered so well, we're focusing a lot of our time on how do we manage human-wildlife conflict? How do we manage these populations? And so how many are there? Well, with mountain lions, we're never really concerned with how many are there total in the state. We were more concerned with how many are there in a particular area. And so you'll hear people say, if you know anything about like mountain lion hunting, they have this quota system, and that they've done is they've gone out and done surveys in a particular area that they're going to open up for mountain lion hunts, areas where we know there are a lot of mountain lions, and we'll keep an eye on their population in that area. But we don't have like a cumulative number for the whole state. That's just, first of all, they're really hard to get a number on, but also we're more concerned with certain areas. So we're not really sure on how many mountain lions there are, but you can guarantee that they are here in the hills of Helena, okay? So we do have them. And so where can mountain lions be found? That's where we're more concerned, is if you look at this map, and it kind of gives you the recency of observations, but also you can see that you're going to find them mostly on the western part of the state. Every once in a while, a mountain lion will make it over to the eastern part of the state, but it doesn't usually last very long. Why do you think that is?
No mountains.
Yeah, there's no cover, and there's also not a lot of tolerance. Historically, they used to be throughout the whole state. Okay, so but there's a lot of agriculture in the eastern part, and so they're not tolerated very well. So they don't usually last very long over there. So where are the grizzlies? Once again, I'm going to go back to these recovery systems here. And if you look at them, I think it's important to know you'll have to see the one that's number 4. That's the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, we have about 1,000 bears is what we're figuring now. If you look at the Yellowstone ecosystem, they're thinking probably like around 850 to 900 bears. Probably more like, it fluctuates, but probably like, if you want to take a rough guess, it'd probably be like 1,800 bears total in that lower 48. And so the rest of them would have a total of about 1,950 bears, grizzly bears in the lower 48. That gives you a sense of most of our bears are in that Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and in that Yellowstone ecosystem. Like the Bitterroot ecosystem, number 5, at this point we haven't seen any bears there yet. If you look at the number one, the North Cascades, they think there's maybe one male bear. And they're going to try to really focus on that North Cascades to recover the grizzly bears there. And that ESA work is just now starting. And then number 3, which is the Cabinet Yak, it ranges because a lot of those bears go back into the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And so there's probably anywhere from 45 to 55 bears there. In Sandpoint, that number 2 is really hard because a lot of them go back up into Canada, back and forth, and they're figuring maybe 30 bears, but it's hard to tell. So most of those bears, 98% of the grizzly bear population in the lower 48 is in that number 4 and number 5. And that is why we just delisted them in the Yellowstone ecosystem, because we've met the criteria for what the population that they were looking at when you're talking about carrying capacity earlier, Stormy. We have met that, and now we're working on it for number 4. So does that kind of give you a sense where we're at with the bears? I'm going to go a little bit further and kind of give you a better idea of what that means. So it's hard to see because it looks like it's getting cut off here, but this map will show you over the years how these bears, the distribution is expanding. So the middle part is Yellowstone, the yellow outline is the recovery area, and now it'll just kind of show you over the years how much their population is increasing, but also their distribution.
how often are the surveys done to get that information?
So it's hard to describe. I have to get into all the methods, but so if you want to think about it, they do the surveys. They're always surveying every year. We're surveying. We start in April when the bears come out of hibernation. We're monitoring throughout the year until they go down again for hibernation, figuring out how many young they have, and they take an average of 7 years and sort of average it out every year. Okay. So it's kind of hard to describe, but it goes back like 7 years. And what we know now is their population is growing on average about 3% every year. Yeah, and they have a pretty high survival rate, because if you think about grizzly bears, do they have a lot of predators except for us? Not really. So once they hit past that yearling mark, being a yearling, their survival rate goes up like that. 55% when they're cubs. Now it used to be higher, it used to be like 68%, but it's gone down a little bit because now with more bears on the landscape, those male bears are also like preying on the young, actually. So this is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And so I wanted to show you this, and this is kind of those little squares that are lit up. The middle part where the red is, that's the original recovery system, but you can see now how those bears are expanding out there. In fact, we have quite a few going off of the Rocky Mountain front, and this isn't even the most recent one. I should be getting that one. So they're actually going out into the prairie now. They're all the way into Fort Peck. They're going, and they're just looking for new home ranges. And so historically, you know, if you think about the Rocky Mountain front, especially if you go like towards the east, historically they used to be across the whole state, but it has been a very long time since they have been. And so what we're working on right now is that human-wildlife conflict piece, and working with landowners. And if you've lived in Kalispell, in the Flathead area, you're used to living with bears. You've been dealing with bears forever because Glacier National Park's right there. But on the Rocky Mountain front, especially as you go further out east, you haven't. And so now we're spending a lot of our time educating. In fact, we have hired new people to go out and educate, new bear managers, to deal with that conflict that is occurring. So then the last one I'm going to show you, just to kind of give you an idea of where they're moving. So you have that Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and then you have the Yellowstone ecosystem, and in between there's this like zone, this area, and those bears are starting to move. They haven't quite made it to Yellowstone from Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, but we're anticipating it's probably going to happen fairly soon, like in the next year or two. And so if you look at this one, this will also show you potential paths for male bears. And so they're moving through. So what we're telling people is if you are on this western part of the state and even off the Rocky Mountain front and you are recreating, chances are there are grizzly bears nearby. Now, it doesn't mean that they're a dense population where you're recreating, but you should be out there being prepared, wearing bear spray, and looking for signs, all the stuff I'm going to talk about today. So they're making these paths. And so we know for a fact that there are these bears that come right through here, the elkhorns right back in here, that make their path, and that's kind of the corridor that they move through. So how do we manage human-wildlife conflict? Well, one thing we do focus on quite a bit is avoiding it. Okay, so one is avoiding an encounter, but also avoiding it by managing attractants, especially on your own private property. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. I'm going to focus mostly on the recreating piece. But what we do know is that there are some things that people have on their private property that are inadvertently, sometimes they don't realize it, are attracting these large carnivores onto their property. And so for like mountain lions, if you think about the things that they like to eat, which are deer, and so if you have deer that are coming into your yard and you live in mountain lion country, you could have a mountain lion coming into your yard. So trying to minimize that, obviously do not feed deer. It's illegal for one, but also not attracting them onto your property on purpose is a really good idea. The other thing too is a lot of the livestock will attract the bears, but more specifically, chickens are the biggest culprit. Because chickens, if you think about it, they're easy prey. We usually contain them in something like this flimsy fence or a chicken coop that a bear can rip apart pretty quickly. And bears have figured it out that they're pretty tasty and pretty good prey. And so what we're asking people is two things. One, if you want to avoid having predators come onto your property, if you have chickens, please use electric fencing to secure them. It's very effective. We know it's the #1 deterrent right now out there. They don't like it, they experience it, and they move on. They're not going to keep coming back either. And it's great for everything, from fox to mountain lions to bears. It works really well. And then also, As far as minimizing deer coming onto your property, and it's also just kind of nice anyways, because I know I personally get very frustrated when I spend a lot of time planting and gardening, and then a deer comes in and wipes it all out. But using more deer-resistant plants, and so these are some examples of some deer-resistant plants that are up by the glacier area that people use on their property. You want to think of it with managing your attractants. Anything with a scent will probably attract a bear onto your property. They're very unusual creatures, and they're not picky. They're known for eating lotion, you name it, soaps. They've gotten into cabins to get at fly paper. So putting garbages away, keeping barbecues put away, don't have bird feeders out. If you live in bear country from the months of April to November, they love bird feed. They love it. Any kind of grain they like. So they're opportunistic. So just if you eliminate that, they'll move on. So I'm going to focus mostly on recreating for the rest of this, because this is when they come onto private property, they can be a nuisance, they can cost money by the destruction that they can cause, and you can occasionally have a run-in on your private property. But where we are seeing most of the encounters happening are when people are recreating, when they're spending time outdoors doing the things that we love to do here in Montana. And the idea behind this is not to discourage people from recreating, because we live in Montana for a reason, and if you didn't get out there and recreate, more than likely you'd move out of Montana, because these long winters can be pretty harsh. You got to have something to look forward to. So the idea behind this is to be smart, and hopefully you won't have an encounter, as well as maybe a little empowering too. So you'll know how to read these animals' behavior and how to react appropriately if you do have one. So when you're recreating, first of all, there are some 3 safety elements. Okay, so first of all is having respect for these animals, having an awareness and knowledge, which is like understanding bears or understanding mountain lions. So I'm going to, hopefully by the time you leave, you'll have a better understanding of these 2 species, and that's going to keep you safe out there. The other thing too is having a respect, and we see it, we hear about it all the time. You hear about it mostly in those large parks where people approach these large animals, what can be dangerous animals, because they don't understand that certain level of respect of giving these animals space. And so they try to get photos, they separate their young from their parents. It's terrible out there. So hopefully by the time you leave, you'll understand these things. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on just understanding bears. And one thing that is kind of good to know is understanding sort of their life history. And remember when I said I'm not really going to get into, it's not as important to know the difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear, but it is to a degree important to know the differences just in understanding how these bears may act differently. But it all goes back to their life history. So remember when I showed you that map of historically grizzly bears were found throughout the whole entire state, right? So they were actually what we would call plains animals. They were not primarily in the mountainous areas. It was because of us eradicating them and pushing them primarily into the mountainous areas is why they're there now. But historically they evolved to be plains animals. So what that means is, like for black bears are just the opposite. So black bears evolved in forested areas. So if you think about their claws are different than a grizzly bear. So their claws are more hooked, right? Shape for climbing trees. Grizzly bears are longer and flatter for digging in the plains, looking for grubs, looking for roots. Very different animals. The grizzly bear has that hump, big hump on its back, which is muscle that evolved over time because it is such a digger and it flips over things to get at things underground. So as a result, because they evolved in forested areas, black bears, they're less confrontational than grizzlies. You think about when we have an encounter with something that is frightening or terrifying, we have that flight-fight mode, right? It's that reptilian part of our brain. Well, animals are just the same. So black bears, because they had cover and things that they could climb and get away from, they chose flight. They evolved to revert to flight. So that's why when you have an encounter with a black bear, a lot of times it'll choose to run or climb a tree. So they're great tree climbers, and you're more likely to see them in populated areas. So you hear about black bears getting into trash, getting into a lot more things in populated areas than you do grizzly bears. Grizzly bears, on the other hand, like I said, they evolved on the plains. And so their go-to is not flight, because would it make much sense if you were living on the plains to run? You can't hide behind anything. So they are more likely to confront threats. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that defensive behavior at the very end if you encounter that. So they're going to be more likely to confront threats. Doesn't mean that they are choosing to eat you, that they see you as food, but when they get defensive, it can be a little bit different. The other thing is they're less likely to be seen in populated areas. However, that's changing a little bit when you have this many on the landscape, right? You're hearing more and more about people seeing, oh, there was a bear in downtown Valier, or there was a bear, going into Stanford. So know that as a general rule, they're going to avoid humans, but we are seeing them now in urban areas. So being able to tell the difference, I'll just kind of run through this pretty quickly. Most people in Montana know this, I found. When I work with youth, they seem to nail it pretty good. But once again, when you're in a bear encounter, that gets really tricky IDing a bear because you're going to have a lot of stress that you're under. But just as a general rule, as I talked about already, the claws are different. Tracks, so sometimes you may not see the bear, but you see bear signs, so it's really easy to identify tracks. In fact, I think it's one of the easiest things to do as far as identifying a bear. If you look at the front track on a grizzly bear and you were to draw a line straight across, all those toes are going to fall above. If you did it on the track on a black bear, that little pinky toe will fall below. And a good way to remember it is black below. And you'll know what kind of species might be in the area. Not because it's important to be able to identify them, but you know that, there's a grizzly bear. If I do have a run-in, it's probably going to be more likely to be confrontational. If it's a black bear, I may not be as worried that it's going to maybe take off running. Everything on a black bear tends to be more pointy. Their ears, their face, it's a much pointier animal, angular animal. Whereas in a grizzly bear, you think of it as more round. Rounder ears, rounder face, they have a dish-shaped nose, they have that hump. Don't rely on color at all. They shouldn't, I wish they'd never even called them black bears because color is, we have black bears that come into our wildlife rehabilitation center that are blonder than that bear in there. They come in cinnamon, browns. Yes, they do come in black too, but also grizzly bears come in really dark brown or almost black too. So don't rely on color at all. Questions about anything I've covered yet? Okay. So another premise is a good way to understand, to give you some knowledge on bears so you can avoid having an encounter is, first of all, where are the bears? Well, follow the food. Because our bears hibernate in the winter and they have to pack on a lot of fat in order to survive. In fact, if you are a female bear, if you don't put on a certain percentage of fat, you will not have your cubs in the winter time. So they have what's called delayed implantation. So they breed in the spring, but it isn't until fall until they actually implants into their uterus. And if there's not enough fat, they will have a miscarriage basically, or their body will absorb it. So it's very important. So they're incredibly food driven. So if you think about it with bears, if you're in an area where there's their food that they like to eat, you need to be probably alert. Does that make sense? Okay, so some of the things they like to eat, there's like you can see a carcass. They will eat meat. However, know that in our state, our bears are primarily what we call omnivores, and they eat a lot of grass, a lot of insects, and a lot of berries. Their diet is a very small percentage of meat. That's why when you go to Alaska and you look at their bears compared to our grizzly bears, much bigger, right? Because those bears are feeding on a lot of fish and a lot of protein. Except along the Rocky Mountain front, those bears are probably about 30% larger than most of the rest of the grizzly bear population because we have a carcass removal program up there. And so when we have a rancher that loses a calf, we relocate that calf up into the mountainous area to hopefully keep the bears from coming down and causing problems. So you'll see there's the cutthroat too. They will eat some cutthroat. In the Yellowstone ecosystem, they like a lot of white park vine, a lot of berries. So that's why when you're talking about understanding bears and you follow the food, that's why when we have a really bad berry year, it can mean a lot more problems with bears because that's something they depend on highly. And then what's really cool is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard, but they rely heavily on insects. And a perfect example is these army cutworm moths that they will feed on, and they're underneath the rocks, and they will eat up to like 40,000 of them a day. And because they're a really high source of protein. So just know that, I know it makes it tricky because you can be anywhere, because they feed on almost 266 different types of plant species. So if there's food, there, you might encounter. And it's the same thing with like mountain lions. If you see deer, you see the things that they like to prey on, you may have one in the area. So the other thing that is important to know is like a bear's yearly cycle. So it's just in terms of when you're out recreating, okay, what's the chances or the likelihood that I might have a bear encounter? A lot of it depends on the yearly cycle. So in the spring, when they're first coming out of hibernation, and if you're a male bear, you're usually coming out right around mid-March, maybe even sometimes beginning March, if the weather's good. And females tend to come out more in April, and they're usually coming out with their cubs. And they're really hungry, right? So they're typically, at that time of year, they're getting down into the lower elevations. Because remember, we saw all that snowpack up in the higher elevations, right? And are they able to feed on grass and berries and everything up in the higher elevations? Probably not. So they're going to come down to the lower elevations to feed. So in spring, they're pretty hungry, but they're pretty fixated on food. And then they're going to be in those lower elevations. Then in summer, when food is a little bit more plentiful and the thaws happen, they tend to move more up into higher elevations. But that doesn't mean you're not going to see them in the lower elevations. But that's typically what they're doing. And they're eating a lot, but there's a lot of food resources for them usually. So when you have a run-in with them, they're not agitated. They're not super fixated on finding food because it's plentiful around them. That changes a little bit in the fall because they go through what's called hyperphagia. And so that's probably, if you're going to be more concerned about having a bear encounter than any other time of the year, I'd say fall is the worst time of year to have a bear encounter. Because they are so fixated on food. They're eating like 20 hours a day. And they're consuming about 20,000 calories a day. So I want you to think about like if you were put out into the woods and what's our calorie average?
3,200.
Yeah, 3,200. Imagine how much you would have to eat 20 hours a day probably to put on 20,000 calories. Eat 20,000 calories. So that means that the bear isn't really paying attention much to anything else but food. So that's why when those encounters happen when we startle the bear. Because the bear may be like 10 feet from us and not even see us, not even notice there because it's just fixated on food. So fall is probably one of the most dangerous times. And then winter, they're hibernating, right? So from like into November, mid-November, they start going down until once again that March period. You don't have to worry about them as much. However, they do come out of their den sometimes and they'll wander around pretty punchy. They're tired. They're not coming out to eat usually or anything, and they'll go back in. However, one thing that we've noticed, like in Yellowstone, for example, wolves are creating a dynamic where there is food for them because the wolves will take down an animal. And so we have some bears down there that are going down really late, and maybe like a couple of them that aren't going down at all because it's all driven by food. There's not enough food for them in the winter, so that's why they go down. Make sense? Okay. So when you're recreating, so that's sort of understanding a little bit about, their life cycles, understanding, how they evolved, but then there's also some universal messages that will hopefully keep you safe. And first of all, know that bears can be anywhere. Now, unless you're maybe in the very far part of the eastern part of the state, less likely chance, but just know that they can pretty much be anywhere. Bear behavior rather than species determines your response in a bear encounter, so don't get hung up on identifying them. And avoiding a conflict with bears is easier than dealing with conflict, right? And stop me anytime you guys if you have any questions. Same thing with the people who are on the call. If you have any questions, just stop me. So one thing that we really want to focus on is avoiding an encounter is staying alert, making noise, and traveling in groups. And then we are encouraging you carry bear spray in case you forget to do one of these three things. Because staying alert is really good because we are recreating, we're going into areas where there may be bears or mountain lions. We've got to make our presence known, so that's why we make a lot of noise. So if you think about it, you're going to be making a lot more noise when you're coming into a brushy area where they poor visibility, or you're walking into a wooded area, especially during the day. Bears are most active at dusk and dawn, and during the day they might be napping. They have these little day beds that they go into, so you need to make even more noise. Or if you're walking down to a river or stream where there's a lot of noise from the water, you need to be even louder to give them let them know of your presence, because they're like pretty much all wildlife. Does wildlife want to approach us usually when they hear us? What do? They're getting out of there. Yep. So making yourself known. Traveling in groups is also really good. and looking for these signs. So I'm going to this is where I'm going to include some of this mountain lion stuff too. So mountain lions do these things called scrapes. They're going to be really hard to figure out or notice in the wild. But what they do is they will mark their territory, or not even mark their territory, more their home range, by, just like a cat would do, like a domestic cat, peeing, pooping, and they bury things and they dig things up, and so it's called it's almost like a cat litter box, really, but they're spraying and they're marking their territory, so it's called scrapes. Scat is another one. It's going to be hard to find mountain lion scat because just like domestic cats, they bury their scat. In fact, if they have a carcass that they're feeding on for a couple of days, they will have a designated spot like a litter box, where they will go to the restroom. So it's going to be really hard to find mountain lion scat. But bear scat's pretty prominent, and usually it's on the trail, because bears, just like us, like to use trails. They don't like to navigate through brushy area. They like to use those trails. So looking for bear scat. This picture is one, you can see the grass in it. However, at certain times of year, and depending on what they're eating, it could look completely different. Like if you're eating a lot of fruit, what happens to us? Same thing with bears. They get a lot of diarrhea, so it may just be a big splat with a lot of berry seeds in it. Looking at tracks, those are some mountain lion tracks. To the left, that's a bear track and a mountain lion track in that one. Imagine if you came across that one. That'd be kind of unnerving, huh? Overturned rocks and logs is another one, especially if the soil underneath looks pretty fresh. Here's where they are looking for one of those insects again. So you might see a big area overturned, and they're just digging there. Sometimes they're looking for plants that are more root-based too. Scratches on trees, that could be mountain lion, or it could be a bear, and bears usually have hair mixed in as well. They like to scratch on the trees to mark their scent. This is a real dangerous sign. This is called a cache. They can't eat all their food at once, so often they'll bury it, because we have refrigerators and cupboards and those kind of things, but they don't, right? So they cover it up, and they're very territorial about their food. So this is actually a mountain lion cache to the left of a wolf. And then you can see, once you don't find a lot of stuff on it and it looks pretty much eaten, then that animal may have moved on. But either way, if you see something like this, you should be getting out of there. So lots of birds, like blackbirds, ravens, crows, magpies, vultures, you need to be getting out of there, because more than likely there might be a carcass nearby, and you might have on that carcass either a mountain lion, a bear, or a combination of. So going in the other direction is a really good idea. So let's say you weren't able to travel in a group, or you weren't able to make a lot of noise, or you just forgot, and now you are in your situation where you're having an encounter. So the last part of my presentation is going to focus on what to do, and it's really all about reading behavior. So in an encounter, when we have with an animal, they're just like us, they communicate, but we're not going to understand their language, and we're also maybe not, if we don't understand their body language, things can go bad pretty quickly. However, if you understand at least some of the things that they're communicating through body language and some of their vocalizations, you will know how you should be reacting in that encounter. So the best kind of encounter is they don't notice you, right? And so they're in the distance, or they're just so busy feeding they don't notice you. What do you think you should be doing? Leaving. Yep, getting out there, going the opposite direction, going, whoo. But definitely not drawing attention to yourself by approaching the animal. And never ever approach a mountain lion, a bear. It's not a good idea. Bison. It's not a good idea, because even this behavior can turn like that if they notice you or if they start to feel threatened. So this is there's actually two kinds of behavior. There's submissive and there's indifferent behavior. Indifferent behavior is a behavior you'll often see in big parks. They're used to people, they've been around people, they're eating, and all of a sudden they notice you and they go right back to whatever they're doing, and they seem like they could care less. Once again, you're getting out of there and giving that bear space. And then submissive behaviors is they are afraid of you and they see you as a threat and they're leaving the area. And that could be, first of all, indicated by they do this, where they kind of move their head to the side like a dog would and look at you, or they're running, or they're climbing a tree. And once again, we're going in the opposite direction and giving that animal space. But so many people, we're finding nowadays especially, are using that as an opportunity, or they're misreading that behavior and saying, oh, this bear is afraid of me, so I'm going to get closer and get a picture of this animal, right? Or I want to get a closer look, or I want to see where it went. So then this behavior can change to something completely different. And this behavior is called alert and curious behavior, and the animal's just not really sure if you are a threat. Sometimes they're not even sure what you are. They've never had a human encounter. And so you can see this picture of the mountain lion to the left. It's just kind of its ears up. It's kind of looking. It's curious. And in bears, they'll often get up on their 2 hind feet. Bears see, they smell really well. Okay, they can smell 7 times greater than a dog. So if you think of how well a dog can smell, imagine that times 7. Okay, so it's really good sense of smell. Their eyes are about the same eyesight as us. So they can still see okay, but not real far distances. So they might smell you first and trying to figure out where you are, and they'll get up on their hind legs like that. This is when things start to get a little bit bad, I guess, is when the animal gets stressed or feels threatened. Stress behavior in a mountain lion, ears are still up, you'll see a little bit, but it's starting to drool. And so bears and mountain lions both, when they get stressed out, they'll over salivate. And so like we are just the opposite, right? As humans, we tend to get that dry mouth if we get scared or we get really mad. With them, they over salivate. Bears will start yawning. It's not that they're bored or they're tired. And dogs do this too. If you've ever noticed when a dog gets stressed, it'll yawn sometimes. So bears will do that. So that's the kind of things are getting a little bit bad. You need to get in that animal's face, getting out of there. And this is when things start to get more serious. And this is called defensive behavior or threatened behavior. You'll hear agitated behavior. This is when they see you as a threat and now they're stressed out. And so you can see with the mountain lion, it's just like a domestic cat. Ears are back, it's hissing, its fangs are up. This is defensive behavior. This is not predatory behavior. And you'll hear people talk about their run-ins with mountain lions. I was up there and it followed me for like 3 miles. That's more predatory. Or I had this mountain lion and it was in the movies, you know, they show them like hissing and they're getting ready to pounce and they're doing all this. That's defensive. And it's the same thing with bears too. So with bears, ears are back flat, a lot more vocalization. A lot of times they're doing that woofing, or they're swatting the ground, or they're popping their jaws, or they're bellowing, which is like almost like a horse sounds, like a horse neighing, but it's louder and deeper. And then if you're a cub, it'll sound like a baby crying. They will jump back and forth. They'll do a lot of posturing because they're scared. And so once again, you're kind of making sure you're not approaching that bear, but at this point you may be standing your ground and assessing the situation. You're not running. You will never outrun a mountain lion or bear, so don't even go there. Your flight mode will want to kick in, but you're not gonna outrun them. They can cover, like a bear can cover 40 feet in 2 seconds. They run very fast. And a mountain lion can leap like 30 feet. So you're not going to outrun them. So standing your ground is a much better scenario. This is the worst case behavior. This is charging behavior, but this also falls under that category of defensive behavior. It's sort of like they're posturing and they do it in the wild with each other, and they would do what's called bluff charging, and they may run at you and stop and retreat. Run and retreat. It's sort of like 2 kids on the playground that are like with their hands up and their fists are clenched, but they never actually hit each other. It's sort of the same behavior, but you're not going to know that, right? So it's going to be pretty terrifying when you have an animal this size moving at you at about 35 miles per hour. So the last behavior I'm going to focus on is predatory, and then I'm just going to kind of run you through a few scenarios and how to do that and kind of wrap it up with just show you real quickly bear spray. So predatory behavior looks much different in both mountain lions and bears. Predatory behavior is, as you would imagine it, it's quiet. They're not vocalizing, they're not posturing. Feels like you're being stalked. They're approaching you, and they're not deterring. They're not doing any of that posturing. That could be predatory behavior. And predatory behavior is much different in how you deal with it. So predatory behavior, are you playing dead? No, right? Because you're making it easy. Are you running? No, because that's probably going to kick it in even more. So you're always standing your ground and you're always fighting back. And that's the only difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear and how you react. So if a black bear is coming at you and attacking you, you are never playing dead. Because more than likely it could be predatory. Because black bears are much more predatory than grizzly bears. If it's coming into your tent at night, you have not had a run with this bear, it's seeking you out, and you haven't brought any attractants into your tent, that could be predatory and you're always fighting back. Because you know they tell you when you're a grizzly bear, you're going to play dead, right? But if it's a black bear, you're gonna be fighting back. And once again, it's gonna look much different. It's not gonna have the blustering, the defensive, it's gonna be stalking you. Good news is they're very rare in Montana. Most of them are defensive. Very, very rare. So I'm gonna kind of wrap it up with a couple scenarios and just talk a little bit about bear spray. And so in those scenarios, obviously if it doesn't see you, you're leaving the area. If it's submissive, it's indifferent to behavior, you're avoiding that bear, you're giving that bear space, you're getting out there. Once things start to get aggressive because they're defensive, then now things are changing a little bit. Now you're sort of assessing the situation, you're standing your ground usually, you're talking in a calm manner, you're not making yourself look big and yelling at a bear. That's not a good idea. That could make it seem like you are aggressive. But you are letting them know that you are not prey, that you're not going to run, and you hopefully have bear spray on you. We know that bear spray is the best deterrent out there. It just is. Hands down better than a firearm. I get into arguments with people all the time about this, but I'm going to tell you right now in a bear encounter, you will become half the person that you normally are. It's just inevitable because your adrenaline's going to course through your body, your hearing is going to get impaired, your vision's going to get like tunnel vision, your fine motor skills are going to get impaired. But the thing about bear spray is you just need to get it out there. You don't have to worry about getting a small bullet in a kill shot, which is their forehead, at an object that's moving at you, sometimes up to 35 miles per hour. You just need to get it out there and kind of build a wall. So let's say you come around the corner and there's a bear right around the corner, but it's like 300 feet away. And it gets up on its hind legs and then it starts to charge. That's when you're going to get your bear spray out. I would recommend having your bear spray out if you see a bear, just in case, because things can turn pretty quickly. Once that bear gets within, if it decides to charge, within 60 feet of you, 30 to 60 feet, like the length of a school bus is a good way to figure it. That's when you're going to deploy it. Don't deploy it when it's within, even though it says on here 20 feet, okay, don't wait till then. Because that bear is going to have momentum, and it's probably going to end up, even if it gets in its system, he's probably going to be on you already. This stuff shoots out a lot, so even if you get it out when it's at 60 feet, it's going to get in their system, and they're not going to like it. Don't use all of your can either, because you might need to use it a second time, or if you have to hike out in the direction that the animal just went, you're going to feel a lot better if you have some bear spray on you, right? So that's if you have some distance to work with. Your bear spray's out, you're ready to go, and you're just making sure that you're not shooting directly into the ground or way up high, kind of a little bit lower. Think about where a bear's head's going to be versus like our shoulders. A bear's head is not at our shoulders, so kind of down a little bit and just get a little bit out there. A little goes a long way. It's almost like a fire extinguisher. So you don't need to worry about using your whole can, even though you're going to be tempted to. Now let's say you come around the corner and that bear is like right there. You forgot to make noise and it's like 10 feet away from you and it flips around and it starts to come at you. The best that you can hope for is you can get to your bear spray. You can shoot from the hip if you need to. If that bear makes contact with you and knocks you off your feet, you want to protect your face by laying down flat. You want to have your arms kind of to the side. You want to get to your bear spray then and then spray that bear in the face. Okay, don't play dead if you have bear spray on you. Use your defense. The other thing too is if you don't have bear spray, cover those vital areas, which is the back of your neck and the back of your head. If it is a grizzly bear, because it's a threatened attack, you are going to play dead or lay still until that bear goes away. Does that make sense? Mountain lions, bear spray. This stuff is so effective on most wildlife. Moose, mountain lions, bears, this is the stuff you want to carry with you. And in fact, this is what our bear managers carry on them. This is what our wardens carry on them. This is when I used to ask most wardens what's the first thing they're going to go for, is their bear spray or their firearm. They're going to say bear spray. So this is really a good way to go. And you want to make sure that it isn't expired and they have an expiration date on there. And you want to make sure it's readily available. So that I love this belt. You can't really see probably people that are calling in, but it's called a scat belt. It can go easily around your waist. It just clips on. So like let's say, like for me, when I'm camping, I usually have to go to the bathroom about 3 times during the middle of the night, and I have to get out of my tent. I don't want to have to, hook it onto my belt. I can just grab this, hook it around my waist. Or if I'm fishing, I can put it in the back. I have my stuff here. If you're trail running, you can tighten it so it's not bouncing. If you're on a bike, same thing. This is a really nice belt. If you work in the field too, like a lot of people who work, like our biologists, prefer this one because it's not flopping around. It's really a preference though.